Alien King gifted his daughter to the human that saved her. James Hunter crouched in the dense undergrowth of Kepler 186f, his thermal imaging goggles revealing the heat signatures of the massive predator stalking through the phosphorescent forest ahead. The creature, which the locals called a shadow striker, moved with lethal grace on its 6 legs, each ending in razor-sharp talons that could slice through reinforced metal as if it were paper. James had spent the last 3 years studying these apex predators, learning their hunting patterns and behavioral traits. His work had already revolutionized the field of xenobiology, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't here as a scientist. The distress beacon's coordinates pulsed on his heads-up display, growing stronger as he approached the hunting grounds. Someone had wandered into the Shadow Striker's territory, and if James didn't reach them soon, they wouldn't survive the night. A flash of movement caught his attention, but it wasn't the predator. Through the ethereal glow of the bioluminescent vegetation, James glimpsed a figure that made his breath catch in his throat. An Arcosian. Their species was humanoid in basic form, but that's where the similarities ended. This one was clearly female, her tall, elegant frame covered in smooth, iridescent scales that shifted between deep purple and midnight blue with each movement, creating mesmerizing patterns across her body. Her figure was captivating, tall and graceful, with curves that somehow managed to be both alien and alluring at once. Her face was exotic yet breathtaking. Large, upward-slanting eyes that glowed with an inner amber fire, high cheekbones that swept back into delicate fins that framed her face like living artwork, and full lips that shimmered with an opalescent sheen. A cascade of what looked like silken tendrils flowed from her head like hair, each strand shifting through shades of deep purple and electric blue. She wore the intricate ceremonial garments of Arcosian royalty, though they were now torn and muddied from her flight through the forest. James's heart raced as realization struck. This wasn't just any Arcosian. This was Princess Nyara, daughter of King Vorkoth, ruler of the entire southern continent. The Shadow Striker had also noticed her. It moved with practiced precision, using the phosphorescent foliage as cover while it maneuvered into striking position. The princess was backing away slowly, but she was heading right into the killer's trap. James knew he had seconds to act. The creature was using classic pack hunting techniques, similar to Earth's ancient raptors. But unlike those long-extinct predators, Shadow Strikers had evolved a unique ability to bend light around their bodies, making them nearly invisible to their prey. Nearly invisible, but not to someone who knew exactly what to look for. The princess moved with fluid grace, each motion highlighting the subtle play of colors across her scales. Right now, that beauty was just helping the predator track her. James had to time this perfectly. He reached for the specialized neural disruptor on his belt, a tool he'd developed specifically for Shadow Strikers after his first year of research. The predator tensed, its muscles coiling for the strike. In that split second before it launched, James burst from cover, triggering the disruptor. The device emitted a precise frequency that interfered with the creature's unique nervous system, causing its light-bending abilities to fail. The Shadow Striker materialized fully, its midnight black carapace reflecting the forest's glow as it tumbled mid-leap, crashing into the underbrush with a screech of confusion. The princess whirled around, her eyes flaring bright with surprise as she took in both her savior and the now visible threat that had nearly claimed her life. James didn't waste time with introductions. He grabbed her hand, noting absently how her scales felt like warm silk against his skin, and pulled her away from the disoriented predator. "Run!" he commanded, knowing they had less than a minute before the creature recovered. They crashed through the luminescent forest together, the princess matching his pace with unexpected agility. Behind them, an enraged roar echoed through the trees, signaling that the hunt was far from over. This was going to be a very long night. James's mind raced as fast as his feet. The neural disruptor would only disorient the Shadow Striker for a few minutes at most, and these creatures were known for their tenacity once they picked a target. He maintained a firm grip on the princess's hand, hyper-aware of the silken texture of her scales against his palm as they wove through the bioluminescent undergrowth. "There's a research station 2 kilometers north," he said between controlled breaths. "We can make it if we—" A thunderous crash behind them cut him off. The Shadow Striker was already recovering, and by the sound of it, it was furious. Princess Nyara's grip tightened on his hand, her amber eyes glowing brighter with what James recognized as fear. "Your device," she spoke for the first time, her voice carrying an exotic, musical quality that sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. "Why not use it again?" "1 shot per power cell," James explained, helping her over a fallen tree trunk. "And I used my spare last week on a juvenile that wandered too close to the station." The princess's free hand brushed against his arm as she regained her balance, the touch sending sparks of electricity through his nervous system. Her scales were radiating heat now, their color shifting to deeper shades of purple, a physiological response he'd never observed in Arcosians before. "Then we run," she said, her voice carrying a determination that matched the steel in her gaze. "But you should know, human, that Shadow Strikers hunt in pairs," James finished, just as a second massive shape detached itself from the darkness ahead of them. "I know." They skidded to a halt, the princess's tendrils flowing around her face like underwater plants caught in a current. The second Shadow Striker was larger than the first, its light-bending capabilities creating a shimmering distortion in the air as it stalked toward them. Behind them, the first predator was closing in, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. James pulled the princess close, his body responding to her proximity despite the dire situation. "Do you trust me?" he whispered, his lips nearly brushing one of her sensitized head fins. She turned to face him, those remarkable eyes searching his face. "I don't even know your name," she breathed, her scales flickering with patterns he couldn't decode. "James Hunter," he said, allowing himself a small smile, "and I'm about to do something incredibly stupid." Without warning, he wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her tight against him, noting how perfectly she seemed to fit against his body despite their alien anatomies. Her scales pulsed with brilliant blues and purples at the contact, and he felt her sharp intake of breath. "Hold on to me," he instructed, reaching for his belt with his free hand, "and whatever happens, don't let go." The princess's arms wound around his neck, her body pressed flush against his. "I won't," she promised, the words carrying a weight that seemed to transcend their immediate danger. James pulled out his last resort, a prototype grappling device he'd been developing for close encounters with the local wildlife. He'd only tested it twice, and both times had left him with spectacular bruises. But right now, it was their only option. The Shadow Strikers moved in perfect sync, their massive forms cutting off any escape route along the ground. James aimed the grappling device at a thick branch high above them, his heart pounding as much from the princess's intimate embrace as from the imminent danger. "Ready?" he asked, feeling her nod against his chest. Her scales were almost hot now, their patterns shifting in rapid waves that seemed to match his elevated heartbeat. The predators lunged. James fired. The grappling line shot upward, its smart metal hook embedding itself deep in the branch. James triggered the retraction sequence immediately, and they were yanked skyward just as the Shadow Strikers collided below them, their massive bodies crashing together where James and the princess had stood moments before. They shot upward through the glowing canopy, the princess's arms tightening around him as they broke through the leafy ceiling. For a moment, they were suspended in the air, and James caught a glimpse of her face illuminated by Kepler 186's 3 moons. Her expression of exhilaration and wonder made his breath catch, and for a dangerous second, he forgot they were in the middle of escaping certain death. Then gravity reasserted itself and they began to fall. James's mind shifted into overdrive as they plummeted through the canopy. The grappling line was still attached to the branch above, which meant he triggered the brake mechanism and the smart metal cable instantly went rigid. Their fall turned into a controlled swing, and James used their momentum to arc them toward a thick cluster of branches. "Brace yourself," he called out to the princess, who was still clinging tightly to him. Her scales had taken on a brilliant azure hue that seemed to pulse in time with her rapid heartbeat. Or was it his? They were pressed so closely together it was impossible to tell. They crashed through the outer branches, James taking the brunt of the impact against his reinforced environment suit. He managed to grab a sturdy limb with his free arm, arresting their fall with a jolt that sent waves of pain through his shoulder. The princess's grip never wavered. For a moment, they hung there in the darkness, their breathing synchronized, bodies pressed together in a way that was becoming increasingly distracting. Below them, the shadow strikers prowled, their frustrated roars echoing through the forest. "Are you hurt?" James asked softly, suddenly very aware of how the princess's body was moving against his with each breath. "No," she replied, her voice equally quiet. She pulled back slightly to look at him, her amber eyes practically glowing in the darkness. "That was impressive. Most of my kind would have frozen in fear." James managed a small grin despite their precarious position. "Most of your kind haven't spent 3 years studying these creatures," he said, then added, "though I usually observe from a safer distance." Her head fins fluttered in what he recognized as amusement, the motion sending a subtle wave of something like perfume past him, a sweet, intoxicating scent that made his head swim. "And do you often rescue princesses from certain death, James Hunter?" The way she said his name, with that musical lilt to her voice, did strange things to his pulse rate. "First time, actually. I usually stick to collecting biological samples and behavioral data." She shifted against him, and James had to suppress a groan as her scales brushed against the exposed skin of his neck. "Then perhaps fate had other plans for you tonight," she murmured, her face close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. A thunderous impact against their tree branch shattered the moment. The shadow strikers had begun ramming the trunk, trying to shake them loose. "We need to move," James said, reluctantly focusing on their survival. "The research station isn't far, but we'll have to stay in the canopy. They can't climb, but they'll follow us on the ground." Nyara's fins rippled with determination. "Lead the way," she said, adjusting her grip on him to allow for more mobility while maintaining their intimate contact. "I trust you." Those words, combined with her continued embrace, sent a surge of protective instinct through James that surprised him with its intensity. He began moving them through the upper branches, using his grappling device to bridge larger gaps while keeping them well above the hunting predators below. The princess moved with him in perfect synchronization, as if they'd done this 100 times before. Her natural grace complemented his calculated movements, making what should have been an awkward journey through the treetops into something almost elegant. "Your species continues to fascinate me," she said during a brief pause while James scouted their next path. Her scales had settled into a deep pulsing indigo that seemed to reflect the starlight filtering through the leaves. "Such resourcefulness, such adaptability. We have legends about humans, you know." James secured their position on a wide branch but didn't release her. The excuse of needing to stay close for safety was becoming thinner by the moment. "Oh, and what do these legends say?" She traced a finger along the collar of his environment suit, the touch sending electricity down his spine. "They say that humans are the universe's perfect survivors, that you can endure any hardship, overcome any obstacle, adapt to any world." Her eyes met his, filled with an intensity that made his breath catch. That to be chosen by a human is to be chosen by the stars themselves. Before James could process the implications of her words, a distant sound caught his attention. The distinctive whine of approaching hover vehicles. The rescue party he'd called for when he first detected the distress beacon was finally arriving. The royal palace of Arcos Prime stretched toward the alien sky like a living mountain of marble and steel, its organic architecture flowing in curves that seemed to defy gravity. James stood before the massive entrance, still dressed in his field gear, acutely aware of the dried mud and torn fabric that made him stand out among the pristinely dressed Arcosian royal guard. King Vorkath himself had insisted on an immediate audience after hearing of his daughter's rescue. James couldn't help but notice how the guards' hand cannons never quite pointed away from him as they escorted him through the sweeping corridors. The throne room was a vast chamber, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. The king sat upon a raised dais, his scales a deep midnight blue that bordered on black, a sign of age and wisdom among their species. Unlike his daughter's fluid grace, He carried himself with an immense, predatory presence that reminded James of the shadow strikers they'd escaped mere hours ago. "Approach, human," the king's voice resonated through the chamber. James complied, noting how Princess Niara stood at her father's right hand, her scales now shimmering with subtle patterns that seemed almost anticipatory. "Your Majesty," James bowed, recalling the protocols he'd studied during his first year on this world. "I'm honored by your—" "You saved my daughter's life," the king interrupted, his tone unreadable. "Our laws regarding such acts are ancient and absolute." James glanced at Niara, confused. She met his gaze with those mesmerizing amber eyes, and he could have sworn he saw the ghost of a smile play across her lips. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Your Majesty," James said carefully. "I only did what anyone would have done in that situation." The king's scales rippled with what might have been amusement. "But it wasn't anyone else who saved her, was it? It was you, James Hunter. You, who developed tools specifically to combat our world's deadliest predator. You, who risked your own life to ensure her safety. And now, by our most sacred laws, you must be rewarded." James's scientific mind began piecing together fragments of conversation from the past few hours. Nyara's words about human legends, the way she'd seemed almost pleased despite their dire situation, the anticipatory gleam in her eyes now. "The law is clear," the king continued, his voice growing more formal. "One who saves a member of the royal family must be bound to them to ensure such protection may be offered again if needed. Therefore, I hereby gift you my daughter's hand in marriage." The chamber fell silent. James's heart thundered in his chest as he processed the king's words. Marriage? To an alien princess? He looked at Nara again, and this time there was no mistaking the triumph in her expression. A memory flashed through his mind, her scales shifting to deep purple when he'd first touched her, a reaction he'd never observed in other Arcosians. The way she'd moved against him in the trees, each touch lingering longer than necessary. Her convenient presence in one of the few areas he regularly patrolled. "This wasn't an accident," he said softly, realization dawning. "You planned this." Nara stepped down from the dais, moving toward him with that liquid grace that had captivated him from the start. Her scales were shifting through shades he'd never seen before, creating patterns that made his pulse race despite his shock. "I've studied your species for years," she admitted, her voice carrying that musical quality that seemed to bypass all his rational thoughts. "Your adaptability, your intelligence, your strength. When I learned of your work here, I knew you were exactly what I'd been looking for." She was close now, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her scales. "You arranged to be attacked by the Shadow Striker?" "I arranged to be in the right place at the right time," she corrected, reaching out to trace a finger along his jaw. "The Shadow Striker was an unexpected complication, but you exceeded even my highest expectations in handling it." James should have been angry at being manipulated, should have felt used. Instead, he found himself admiring the brilliance of her strategy, even as her touch sent fire through his veins. "And if I refuse?" Her head fins fluttered in that way he now recognized as amusement. "Why would you want to?" she purred, her scales taking on that deep purple hue that he now understood was reserved only for him. "We both know you feel this connection between us. Why fight what fate has clearly arranged?" The worst part was, she was right. Despite the manipulation, despite the cultural chasm between them, despite everything logical in his mind screaming that this was insane, he wanted her. Had wanted her from the moment he first saw her in that phosphorescent forest. The king's private study was a stark contrast to the grand throne room. Here, ancient texts lined the walls, and holographic star charts floated in the air, depicting trade routes and territorial boundaries. James sat across from King Vorkoth, trying to focus on the monarch's words rather than the way Niara was moving through the room behind them, each motion deliberately drawing his eye. "You must understand," the king said, his scales reflecting the soft light of the holograms, "that while my daughter orchestrated your meeting, the law itself is quite real and quite binding." James leaned forward, his environment suit creaking slightly. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, I'm a xenobiologist, not a politician. Surely there are better candidates for a royal marriage." "Better?" Nyara's voice came from directly behind him, her breath warm against his ear. I've watched recordings of you tracking shadow strikers for months, studying them, understanding them. While our strongest warriors cower in fear, you walk among them with nothing but your mind and your tools to protect you. Her hand slid onto his shoulders, and James had to suppress a shudder as her scales brushed against his neck. The king watched their interaction with what appeared to be approval. "My daughter speaks truth," Vorkath rumbled. "Our people value strength, but not merely of the body. You've shown cunning, adaptability, and courage, traits we believe humans possess in abundance." James stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between himself and Nara's intoxicating presence. "This is insane. I came to your world to study its wildlife, not to get entangled in royal politics." "And yet," Nyara moved to face him, her amber eyes catching the starlight from the holograms, "you can't deny there's something between us. I felt your heart race when we touched, saw how your pupils dilated whenever I moved against you in the forest." She stepped closer, and James found himself backing up until he hit one of the study's massive bookshelves. Nyara followed, placing one hand on his chest while the other traced patterns on his arm that matched the swirling colors in her scales. "Tell me," she purred, her head fins quivering with barely contained emotion, "that you don't want to study every inch of these scales, that you aren't fascinated by how they change color with my moods." Her body pressed against his, warm and impossibly soft despite the alien texture. "That you haven't already started theorizing about human-Arcosian compatibility." James grabbed her wrists, intending to push her away. Instead, he found himself holding her in place, his thumbs brushing over the sensitive scales on her inner wrists. Her sharp intake of breath told him the touch affected her as much as it did him. "You manipulated me," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I created an opportunity," she countered, her scales shifting to that deep purple that seemed reserved for him alone. "Everything that happened after, every touch, every shared breath, every moment of connection, that was real." The king cleared his throat, reminding them both of his presence. "Perhaps I should give you two some privacy to discuss the particulars." He moved toward the door with surprising grace for his size. "But remember, James Hunter, while the marriage is mandated by law, what happens after, that is entirely up to you and my daughter." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving James alone with the alien princess who had so thoroughly upended his life. She was still pressed against him, her scales now practically glowing with patterns he was beginning to recognize as desire. "I know your kind values honesty," she said softly, freeing one wrist from his grip to trace the line of his jaw. "So let me be honest now. I chose you, James, not just for your strength or your intelligence, but for the way you see our world, with wonder and curiosity instead of fear." Her finger trailed down his neck, making him shiver. "And I intend to spend our marriage showing you wonders you never imagined possible." The rational part of James's mind was still screaming that this was too fast, too convenient, too dangerous. But with her body against his, her scales creating patterns of light that seemed to match his heartbeat, and her scent filling his lungs like an addictive perfume, rationality was quickly losing the battle. James stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his new quarters in the palace's east wing, watching 3 moons rise over the bioluminescent forest. The same forest where, just 24 hours ago, his life had changed forever. His reflection in the glass showed a man who looked both exhausted and exhilarated, still wearing his damaged environment suit, now adorned with the royal crest of Arcos. The door chimed softly, then slid open with an organic whisper. He didn't need to turn to know it was Nyara. Her unique scent filled the room, making his pulse quicken involuntarily. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, moving to stand beside him. She held out a data tablet, its holographic display showing footage of him facing down the shadow strikers. "My personal surveillance drone captured everything." James took the tablet, studying the footage with professional interest. "You really did plan this thoroughly," he said, noting the multiple camera angles, "though I doubt you anticipated the second shadow striker." "No," she admitted, stepping closer until her arm brushed his. "That moment of genuine fear when they cornered us, it showed me something I hadn't expected." Her scales shifted to a deep burgundy he hadn't seen before. "How much I already trusted you." James set down the tablet and turned to face her. She'd changed out of her ceremonial garments into something more casual, though no less royal. A flowing garment that left her shoulders and arms bare, showcasing the ever-changing patterns in her scales. "I've been studying the marriage laws," he said, trying to maintain his focus. "There are a lot of ceremonial requirements, rituals I'll need to learn." Nyara stepped even closer, eliminating the space between them. "And is that what you're really thinking about right now?" she asked, her head fins quivering with amusement. "Cultural protocols?" Her scent was overwhelming at this distance, and James found his hands moving of their own accord to her bare shoulders. Her scales were warm and impossibly smooth beneath his fingers. "I'm thinking," he said carefully, "that I should be more upset about being manipulated into this marriage." "But," she prompted, her hands finding their way to his chest, seeking skin beneath the torn environment suit. "But I keep remembering how it felt in that forest, how perfectly we moved together, how right it felt to hold you." His fingers traced patterns on her scales, making her shiver. "I'm a scientist. I should be approaching this logically, analyzing all the implications." Nara pressed herself against him fully, her body fitting against his just as perfectly as it had during their escape. "Then study me," she breathed, her amber eyes darkening with desire. "Learn every reaction, document every response." Her scales began shifting through deep purples and blues, creating mesmerizing patterns beneath his touch. "I'll be your most willing research subject." James groaned as her fingers found bare skin beneath his suit. "The temperature regulation in your scales," he murmured, scientist's mind still working despite her distracting touches. "It increases with arousal?" "Very good," she purred, pressing her lips to his neck. "What else can you observe?" His hands slid down her arms, cataloging every texture, every subtle variation in her alien anatomy. "The patterns in your scales, they're not random. They're following my touch, creating feedback loops of color and sensation." She hummed against his skin. "Keep going, what else?" But James was done analyzing. He pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her tendril-like hair while the other pressed against the small of her back. Her scales blazed with color at the contact, and the sound she made was anything but human, a trilling purr that vibrated through his entire body. "Your species continues to impress," she gasped as his lips found a particularly sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder. "Such quick learners." "You haven't seen anything yet," James murmured against her scales. His scientist's mind was cataloging every reaction, every sound, every color shift, but his body was running on pure instinct now. "I think it's time for some hands-on research." Nara's whole body shuddered at his words, her scales creating patterns so complex they seemed to hypnotize. "Show me," she demanded, her alien features transformed by very human desire. "Show me everything humans are capable of." The three moons continued their arc across the alien sky, casting ever-changing shadows through the window. But neither James nor Nara noticed. They were too busy conducting their own very thorough cultural exchange. Dawn found James in his private laboratory, connecting his research terminal to the palace's vast database. His body still tingled from the night's activities, and occasional flashes of memory, scales shifting through impossible colors, alien sounds of pleasure, the feeling of two hearts beating in perfect sync, made it difficult to focus on his work. The door slid open, admitting Nyara. She wore formal attire today, though her scales still flickered with residual patterns of satisfaction when she looked at him. "The High Council demands an audience," she said, moving to lean against his workstation. "They're concerned about our union." James saved his data and stood, noting how she instinctively moved into his personal space. "Political concerns," he asked, running a finger along her arm just to watch the colors chase his touch. "Biological ones," she replied, her expression darkening slightly. "They question the viability of our species' compatibility." Her scales shifted to a deep green he was learning to associate with worry. "Some suggest that a princess who cannot produce an heir is no princess at all." "Ah," James said, understanding dawning. He pulled her closer, gratified by how quickly her scales responded to his touch. "And this wouldn't have anything to do with your cousin Vorthak's claim to the throne?" Nara's head fins flared in surprise. "You've been studying our political structure." "I've been studying everything about your people," he said, his hand sliding to her waist. Did you think I'd stop being a scientist just because you seduced me? Her scales flushed with that deep purple he loved to provoke. And what have your studies revealed? That your cousin has been positioning himself as the pure-blood alternative to you for years. That he's gathered significant support among the more conservative elements of your society. James pulled her tighter against him, his voice dropping lower. That he's probably furious you've bound yourself to a human before he could challenge your claim. Very good, she purred, her hands finding their way under his shirt. And does this political maneuvering concern you? James caught her wandering hands, bringing them to his lips. I'm more interested in proving the High Council wrong about our compatibility. He kissed each of her palms, watching her scales create new patterns he'd never seen before. In fact, I have a theory about that. Oh, her voice hitched as he continued his attentions to her sensitive palms. A scientific theory? He confirmed, releasing one hand to pull up data on his terminal. I've been analyzing the cellular structure of your scales, the way they respond to various stimuli. His free hand traced patterns on her back, making her gasp. They're remarkably adaptive at the molecular level. And this relates to compatibility. How? She managed, though her scales were telling him exactly how affected she was by his touch. Your scales don't just change color, they actively bond with compatible biological material. He pulled her closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Like they did last night, multiple times. Nara's whole body shuddered at the memory, her scales blazing with color. I think, he said, letting his scientist detachment fade into something more primal, that we should gather more data, thoroughly, repeatedly, to present to the High Council. Her scales shifted to a new color, a deep burning gold that seemed to pulse with its own light. For science, of course, she breathed, pulling him toward the private chamber adjoining his lab. Of course, he agreed, already working on the fastenings of her formal attire. We'll need to be very rigorous in our testing. They nearly made it to the chamber before their mutual desire overwhelmed them. Later, James would have to recalibrate several sensitive instruments that their enthusiasm had knocked out of alignment. But as he watched Nyara's scales create entirely new patterns of pleasure beneath his touch, he decided that some data was worth any inconvenience to collect. The High Council chamber was a cathedral-like space carved from living crystal, its walls thrumming with the same bioluminescence as the forest where James and Nyara had first met. But today, the usual soft glow had taken on a harsh, accusatory quality as Vorthak stood before the assembled counselors. This union is an abomination, Nyara's cousin declared, his scales a militant red that matched his ceremonial armor. A human cannot hold claim to our throne, cannot continue our royal bloodline. The princess has doomed her own succession. James stood at Nara's side, watching the proceedings with careful attention. His new formal attire, a blend of human and Arcosian design, marked him as both outsider and royalty, a contradiction that seemed to physically pain the more conservative council members. The law is clear, Nara responded, her voice carrying that musical authority that made James's pulse quicken even now. One who saves royal blood becomes royal blood, or do you question laws that predate your own house's claim to nobility, cousin? Vorthak's scales darkened with rage. I question the judgment of a princess who would soil our lineage with alien blood, who would risk our entire genetic future on the whims of attraction. James felt Nyara tense beside him, her scales shifting through warning patterns of deep blue and violet. Before she could respond, he stepped forward. Speaking of genetics, he said, his voice cutting through the chamber's tension, I've prepared a rather interesting presentation on human Arcosian cellular compatibility. Would you like to see the data, Lord Vorthak? It's quite extensive. The emphasis he placed on the last word made Nara's scales flush that telling purple, and several council members shifted uncomfortably as they recalled the sounds that had been emanating from the royal wing lately. Vorthak's face contorted with disgust. You dare mock our sacred traditions with your alien perversions? Then perhaps we should settle this in the traditional way. His hand moved to the ceremonial blade at his hip. I challenge your claim to the princess's hand, combat in the ancient arena, unless humans lack the courage for our ways. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Trial by combat was rarely invoked, but it was still their highest law. Even the king couldn't intervene if a formal challenge was issued and accepted. James felt Nyara's hand grab his arm, her scales practically vibrating with concern. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "He's been trained since birth in combat arts. No one would fault you for declining." He turned to face her, drinking in the sight of her exotic beauty, the way her scales created patterns that showed her every emotion. In the weeks since their first meeting, he'd mapped every inch of those scales, learned every sound she could make, discovered exactly how compatible their species could be. "Do you trust me?" he asked, echoing his words from that first night in the forest. Her head fins quivered with emotion. "With my life," she replied without hesitation. "But this isn't about trust. Vorthak is a killer. He's eliminated 3 rivals in honorable combat already." James smiled, running a finger along her jaw just to watch her scales respond to his touch. "Then it's a good thing I've spent 3 years studying the deadliest predators on your world. Your cousin may be trained in combat arts, but I've learned something far more valuable." "And what's that?" she asked, leaning into his touch despite her worry. "How to survive," he said simply. Then he turned back to Vorthak, who was watching their intimate exchange with barely contained revulsion. "I accept your challenge, Lord Vorthak, though I should warn you." He let his smile grow predatory, channeling everything he'd learned from studying shadow strikers. "Humans have some combat traditions of our own." The look of uncertainty that flashed across Vorthak's scales was brief but deeply satisfying. James had studied every color pattern, every behavioral sign of his new people, and that momentary shift told him everything he needed to know. Vorthak was used to fighting opponents who followed the rigid forms of Arcosian combat arts. He wasn't prepared for someone who'd learned to think like a predator. The ancient arena rose from the forest floor like a living thing, its walls embedded with the same bioluminescent organisms that lit the nighttime jungle. James stood in the preparation chamber, methodically checking his equipment while Nyara paced behind him. "The traditional blade," she said, holding out an ornate sword that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "You'll need this." James took the weapon, testing its weight. "Beautiful," he said, then set it aside, "but I won't be using it." Her scales flickered with alarm. "You must. To refuse the ceremonial weapon is to forfeit." "The law states I must enter with it," he corrected, pulling tools from his field kit. "Nowhere does it say I have to fight with it." He held up his neural disruptor, the same device that had saved them from the shadow strikers. "I've made some modifications." Nyara moved closer, her concern evident in both her scales and her voice. "This isn't like tracking beasts in the forest. Vorthak is a trained warrior." James pulled her into his arms, feeling the now familiar thrill as her scales shifted to that deep purple reserved only for him. "Tell me," he murmured against her head fins, making her shiver, "what's the primary hunting strategy of a shadow striker?" They use misdirection," she answered, distracted by his proximity. "Make their prey focus on one threat while the real attack comes from another direction." "Exactly." He kissed her briefly but intensely, watching with satisfaction as her scales created those complex patterns of pleasure he'd become addicted to. "Trust me." The arena horns sounded, their deep resonance shaking dust from the ancient walls. James stepped back, securing his modified equipment while trying to memorize how Nyara looked in this moment. Worried yet proud, her scales showing both fear and fierce love. "Come back to me," she commanded, her royal authority wavering slightly. "Always," he promised. Then he turned and entered the arena. The combat space was a perfect circle, its floor covered in phosphorescent sand that would show every movement, every drop of blood. Vorthak already waited in the center, his ceremonial armor gleaming, his scales radiating confidence and aggression. James approached with measured steps, the ceremonial blade held correctly but loosely in his right hand. He cataloged every detail of his opponent's stance, every shift in scale color that might betray intention. This was no different than studying predator behavior, he told himself, just with higher stakes. "I'll make this quick," Vorthak sneered, his own blade held in a classical starting position, though not painless. James said nothing, maintaining a relaxed pose that he knew would infuriate the warrior. The crowd around them murmured, some in disapproval at his apparent disrespect, others in curiosity at his unusual calm. The combat horn sounded again. Vorthak moved with explosive speed, his blade describing lethal arcs through the air as he launched into a traditional attack pattern. James gave ground steadily, his movements economical, never quite where the blade should have found him. "Fight back, coward," Vorthak snarled, his scales flushing darker with rage. James continued his careful retreat, leading his opponent in an ever-tightening spiral. To the crowd, it must have looked like he was being thoroughly outclassed. But Nyara, watching from the royal box, suddenly straightened as she recognized the pattern. It was the same way shadow strikers herded their prey. Vorthak launched a particularly vicious combination, finally forcing James to raise his blade in defense. The ceremonial weapons met with a sound like singing crystal, sending vibrations through both fighters' arms. But James had been counting on that. The modified neural disruptor, hidden in his offhand, activated on contact. The frequency, tuned specifically to Arcosian nervous systems, traveled through the resonating blades directly into Vorthak's sword arm. The warrior's scales spasmed with confusion as his grip weakened. But James wasn't done. Just as a shadow striker used light bending to disorient its prey, he had synchronized the disruptor's pulse to create interference patterns in the arena's bioluminescent sand. To Vorthak's already scrambled senses, the ground itself seemed to shift and wave. His perfect balance, trained over decades, betrayed him. He stumbled, his ceremonial blade slipping from nerveless fingers. James moved then, all pretense of retreat abandoned. 3 precise strikes, learned from studying the shadow striker's hunting technique, and Vorthak crashed to the glowing sand. The ceremonial blade pressed against his throat was almost an afterthought. "Yield," James said quietly. Vorthak's scales showed his shock, his rage, and finally, as he realized how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered, his defeat. "I yield," he gasped. The arena erupted in chaos. No one had ever seen a combat like this. No blood, no classical forms, just pure tactical brilliance. But James didn't hear any of it. His eyes were locked on Nyara, whose scales were creating entirely new patterns of pride, relief, and love. He had won more than just a fight. He had proven that humans could adapt to any challenge, master any environment, overcome any obstacle. And he had done it all without compromising who he was, a scientist who preferred outsmarting his opponents to outfighting them. James stood before the massive windows of the royal bedchamber, his bedchamber now, watching the shadow strikers hunt in the distant forest. Their bioluminescent trails created patterns remarkably similar to Nyara's scales when he touched her just right. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Nyara's voice came from behind him, followed by the whisper of her scales against his bare skin as she pressed against his back. After the victory in the arena, her colors had settled into new patterns he'd never seen before, deeper, richer, more complex. "Observing hunting patterns," he replied, though his hands were already reaching back to pull her closer. "Though I'm a bit distracted." She laughed, the sound musical and seductive. Only a human would watch predators hunt immediately after their own victory. Her scales rippled with that deep purple he loved. "The High Council is in chaos, you know. No one has ever won ritual combat quite like that before." He turned to face her, drinking in the sight of her exotic beauty. The traditional post-victory garments she wore left little to the imagination, though he'd long since memorized every curve, every scale. "And how do they feel about that?" "They're fascinated," she purred, pressing closer. "A human who thinks like our world's apex predator, who uses intelligence over brute force, who combines science and strategy." Her hands traced patterns on his chest. "Some are already suggesting our children will create a new evolutionary step for our species." James caught her wandering hands, bringing them to his lips. "About that," he said, kissing her sensitive palms and watching her scales create those addictive pleasure patterns. "I've been analyzing the data from our compatibility studies." "Oh!" She tried to sound casual, but her scales betrayed her interest, shifting to patterns of anticipation and hope. He guided her to his research terminal, though he kept her firmly in his arms. "Look at this," he said, pulling up microscopic images. "Your scales don't just change color, they actively adapt at the cellular level, and when they interact with human DNA." The images showed something remarkable. cellular structures combining and evolving in ways neither species had seen before. Nara's scales blazed with joy as she understood the implications. "It's possible," she breathed. "We're truly compatible." "More than compatible," James corrected, turning her to face him. "We're catalysts for each other's evolution. Your scales have developed entirely new patterns since we've been together, and my cellular structure shows signs of adaptation I've never seen in human biology." Her hands slid up his chest as she pressed against him fully. "So when you said you wanted to gather more data—" "Purely scientific motivation," he murmured against her head fins, making her shiver. "We should probably run several more tests, to be thorough." She agreed, her scales already shifting to those deep, passionate colors he'd become addicted to. "How many tests did you have in mind?" Instead of answering, James lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward their bed. "I think," he said between kisses, "we should gather data until we've created entirely new colors in your scales." Her laugh turned into a gasp as he demonstrated one of his more recent theories about Arcosian pleasure responses. Outside, the 3 moons rose over the bioluminescent forest, and somewhere in the trees, shadow strikers continued their eternal hunt. But in the royal chamber, a human scientist and an alien princess were conducting their own research into the evolution of their species. And judging by the new patterns blooming across Nyara's scales, their results were going to be spectacular. In the end, James reflected as Nyara's scales created colors he'd never even imagined possible. Some hypotheses were definitely worth testing thoroughly. And this particular experiment, he decided as she pulled him down into an passionate embrace, deserved a lifetime of rigorous study.